Yad Vashem, situated on the Mount of Remembrance in Jerusalem, is the world's foremost remembrance center for the Holocaust. Its chairman, Dani Dayan, once vowed never to set foot in Germany, but has since reversed that decision. He'll accompany an exhibition of artifacts from the Holocaust on display in the Bundestag in Berlin.
Dani Dayan, thank you for your time today.
Thank you for having me.
You vowed that you would never visit Germany, the country responsible for the murder of 6 million Jews, but you are in fact going to Berlin with a special exhibition from the museum here at Yad Vashem. What changed your mind?
You know, I made the decision at a very young age not to visit Germany. But it's nothing to do with hate or something like that. On the contrary, it's everything about memory. You know, there is an interesting Jewish tradition. Not many Jews do it these days, but it still exists. There are Jews that keep a small part of a wall in their apartment, in their home, not painted. Why? In order to remember the destruction of Jerusalem 2,000 years ago. Every time they see it, they remember that Jerusalem was destroyed 2,000 years ago, then the temple was destroyed. That's the reason I did it. It's my stain on the wall. And when I look at the map of the places I visited, I see a white stain on the map of Europe. It's Germany, and I remember why I don't visit Germany. It's to give my respect to the 6 million Jews that were murdered. But the same reason that prevented me from visiting Germany this day is the reason that brings me to Germany now as chairman of Yad Vashem. Because as chairman of Yad Vashem, by visiting Germany, I have the ability to amplify remembrance of the Shoah, to amplify the respect that is paid to the victims, not only on a personal basis, but also on a much larger basis, because it will be reported and seen, and the exhibition will be seen by many persons. So it's basically the same decision. The circumstances change, not my decision.
Right. Now, let's talk a little bit about where we are today. Yad Vashem, it's celebrating, or marking rather, its 70th year this year. How has it developed in these 7 decades as the world's foremost memorial to the victims of the Holocaust?
It has developed completely. First of all, the fact that Yad Vashem was established by Knesset legislation in 1953, but actually the gathering of archival documentation started even before, started in the late 40s, even before the establishment of the State of Israel. But I think that what started as an archive and a bunch of monuments developed into a multifaceted institution that is, as you said, the most prominent, the most important Holocaust remembrance institution in the world. Some of the artifacts that we have here, if you are a human being, bring you to tears immediately the moment you see them. The largest library, an art collection, the art that was produced during the Holocaust or immediately afterward, which is something quite mind-boggling.
It is a remarkable archive that you've managed to be able to collect over these years, but sadly, as the years roll on, we know that many survivors are dying. They will continue to die, and one day there will be, of course, no survivors, no living survivors of the Holocaust left. When there are no survivors, how will that affect, do you think, the memory of the Shoah, and what's the best way to keep that memory alive, do you think?
It will be very challenging. It's clear that our work will be much more difficult, but it also will be much more important. Because when that happens, I am convinced that that will be the happy hour of the denialists and the distortionists that exist also today, but then they will thrive. And that's one of the reasons we, in a race against the clock, against the calendar.
Now, I'd like to talk about your appointment. You took the reins in 2021, something you've called the greatest honor of your life. You were perhaps a surprising candidate for the Yad Vashem chairmanship. You were previously a representative for the settler movement. You also worked as a diplomat representing Israel in New York. At the time of your appointment, there was a bit of debate, there was quite a lot of debate around whether or not that would politicise the role of chairman of Yad Vashem. You vowed at the time to maintain a firewall between yourself and the memorial and politics. Have you managed to do that?
Yes, the moment I was appointed by the government of Israel as chairman of Yad Vashem, I put a firewall between me and politics, and look, the mission I took upon myself is sacred, and I will never stain it with political interests or considerations. I will tell you a story. On my first day in Yad Vashem, I was taken to the Art Museum of Art, and there is a quote on a wall that is in Hebrew and in English, but originally it was written in Yiddish. A painter, Gela Seckstein, that continued to make art in the Warsaw Ghetto, 1941, and she hid her art and it was recovered after the war, but also her last will and testament was recovered. And the quote was from that will. And she says, "I know I am doomed. I will not survive." Indeed, she didn't. But I bequeath my works of art to the Jewish institution that will be established after the war. When I saw that quote, I almost fainted. I understood that she's talking to me. I am now the executor of that will, and not only Gela Seckstein's will, but 6,000,000 wills and testaments. And therefore, it's my obligation to do it in the most objective and clear way I can.
And we're seeing a rise in anti-Semitism around the world. It's something you've spoken about at great length. In what ways do you see that playing out?
Well, a personal story. I arrived to New York in August 2016 to serve as Israel's Consul General there, convinced that anti-Semitism will be in a low place in my agenda. In my time in New York, in the United States, 15 Jews were murdered, not attacked, murdered in anti-Semitic attacks. So anti-Semitism, unfortunately, is thriving again in the world. And you know what I tell world leaders that come to Yad Vashem, especially to world leaders, is when you see anti-Semitism, act immediately. Don't wait. If you wait, anti-Semitism will metastasize into monstrous dimensions, and it will be impossible to stop it.
You actually touched on it before, and I do think it's an important point, though, in the distance between the Holocaust and today. Do you think that there is a correlation between a resurgence of anti-Semitism? You just mentioned that perhaps once the last survivors die out, we might see even a further resurgence of it. Is there a correlation, do you believe, between the events of the Holocaust?
Yes and no. Anti-Semitism is anti-Semitism is anti-Semitism. But we are not in Germany of the 1930s. No, we are not. We are far from it. We should not get close to that, God forbid. But, you know, the difference between our generation, the contemporary generation, Jewish and non-Jewish, and the generation of the 1930s, Jewish and non-Jewish, is that we have experience. We know it can happen. Probably they had the privilege to believe, the naivete to believe that they can burn books and can burn synagogues, but will never burn human beings. We don't have that privilege. We know that it can come to burning human beings. So that's the difference, and that gives us an added responsibility on our shoulders to combat anti-Semitism and racism and xenophobia. Not only anti-Semitism, but anti-Semitism empirically is the most lethal sort of racism. So we have to do it now.
What do you see as Yad Vashem's role in combating anti-Semitism?
Well, you know, the role of Yad Vashem is to remember and make remember the Shoah. We are an organization, I think that 6 million Jews that were massacred in the Shoah are entitled to an organization, an institution that is solely dedicated to them, exclusively dedicated to them. But the very essence of Shoah remembrance is a very powerful tool to combat anti-Semitism. I will give you an example from the last weeks. There were two very prominent American celebrities that made very troubling statements. One is Kanye West. He was clearly an anti-Semite. I wouldn't bring Kanye West to Yad Vashem because it's a waste of time. Probably he would even enjoy Yad Vashem because the Jews are here displayed. Whoopi Goldberg, on the other hand, said that the Shoah was not an issue about race. It was a clash, a conflict between two white groups, which is nonsense. But that's not anti-Semitic. That's ignorance. She simply doesn't know the facts, that the Nazis saw the Jewish people, right or wrong, as a race. And there was no conflict between Jews and the Nazis. There was an onslaught of the Nazis against the Jews. So Whoopi Goldberg, on the other hand, instead of suspending her for 2 weeks, as her network did, they should have sent her to Yad Vashem, because Whoopi Goldberg can be educated. Kanye West, this is a waste of time. So we do not try to educate the anti-Semites. We try to educate the decent people of the world, that I believe are the vast majority, to stand against anti-Semitism.
As you prepare to make your first visit to Germany, what are your expectations or perhaps your hopes and even fears?
Well, yes, I have personal inhibitions, but that is a personal matter between me and myself. You know, in addition to opening the exhibition in the Bundestag with the Speaker of the Bundestag, the President of the Bundestag, I will meet the entire German leadership, the President, the Chancellor, several ministers, the head of the opposition. And we have to think together. I'm not, you know, I come to think together with them, to consult with them and to give them, yes, with all modesty, advice. How to continue to keep the flame of Holocaust remembrance alight, to make sure that you know, there is an academic discussion if the Shoah is unique or unprecedented. Unique means that it happened once and will not happen again. Unprecedented, it didn't happen beforehand, but it happened again. How we keep the Shoah unique, that we educate and we legislate and we enforce law, in order to make sure that that terrible event of the 20th century never happens again, not to the Jewish people, not to any other people, not perpetrated by Germany, not by any other nation.
Danny Dayan, thank you very much for speaking to DW.
Thank you.